What are you doing August 3rd for the National Day of Resistance? Yeah, National Day of Resistance.
Isn't
August
that every
3rd.
day?
Yeah,
in
well, sort of.
Illinois?
This is the one the teachers unions are focused upon, and you know how I know? Because they've set up a website called demandsafeschools.org, which here are the demands: no reopening. No reopening until the scientific data supports it. Police-free schools. All schools must be supported to function as community schools with adequate numbers of counselors, nurses, community parent outreach workers, blah, blah.
Okay.
Moratorium on new charter or voucher programs and standardized testing. Massive infusion of federal money to support the reopening funded by taxing billionaires and Wall Street. Sure, we got all the time in the world to have more tax increases wind their ways through the halls of Congress before we reopen schools, and so on and so forth.
What's the name of that website again?
DemandSafeSchools.org. You know, it'd be nice if people would actually read the teachers' union's stated positions. They're not very cagey about it. They're quite transparent, and thankfully so. The same way Black Lives Matter is very transparent, and thankfully so. You can read what we believe in black and white. This is not... there is no subterfuge here. These are not clandestine operations. They're out and proud. Maybe you should pay attention. By contrast, the Republicans want to provide $105 billion to help schools reopen, most going to meet CDC guidelines for social distancing. Right, our quote-unquote underfunded schools. The lament and false premise that the Republicans buy into to their detriment. But 10% of the $105 billion that Republicans have proposed for school reopenings would be voucherized, set aside for parents to pay for private school, charter school, or homeschooling options, including hiring a teacher for their children or other children in the neighborhood, the so-called pods or co-ops.
Yeah, President Trump discussed that last week.
Up as much as $10,000 per child. So we'll see if the Republicans hold fast on that school choice provision the way they did not with the payroll tax cut. For more on the reopening and the politics of it, we're pleased to be joined by our friend James Bovard. He is the author of many books, more than 10 books, member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, frequent contributor to The Hill, and a contributing editor for the American Conservative. Jim, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate that.
The school reopenings, no reopening until the scientific data supports it. Well, unbeknownst to the teachers union and big city mayors, the scientific data supports it. The scientific data is in. It just doesn't. There's just an unwillingness to incorporate it or abide it. It seems to me.
Well, yeah, scientific data is turned into a magic wand that the politicians can use to shut down anything that they choose, including churches as well as schools. And it's completely arbitrary. And I'm here in Maryland. I'm watching how some of the county governments make stuff up with the numbers, and there was an uptick, so we've got to shut down everything, all the bars and all this, that, and the other again, because there was a 0.02 uptick, and it's like, you're doing more testing, you're doing this, you're doing that, and yet it's surprising to me that most of the media is so deferential. It's interesting. There was a big controversy around the schools the schools here are not going to reopen in later next month, September, but what some of the teachers are kind of boasting about on Facebook, I've been told, is that this is for the teachers. It's like a snow day. It's like a snow day that never ends because they're not going to have to work nearly as hard. They're going to get a full salary. Property taxes aren't being cut. I can vouch for that. And yet the system is, most of the media coverage is so deferential to the government agencies and the school officials. There's so much BS that's not being exposed.
Well, the media is cheering this on, and they're exposing every child. This kid has COVID, but they don't not saying the truth that they had underlying comorbidities, and they're just it's scaring and panic striking parents so much so that they're lobotomized, and they're so fearful now of their kids going back to school, even church. People aren't fully going back to church in certain neighborhoods because we've frightened them into submission.
Well, and it's kind of a bellwether for the state of American freedom that so many people can become so frightened, and many of those people that become full of fear. The easy next step is to become full of hatred for anyone who is not as frightened, who's not wearing a mask when they're outside walking along Lake Michigan or whatever.
Oh, that's happening.
Yeah, I interviewed on my syndicated show last night. I interviewed Martin Kulldorff, who's a medical professor at Harvard Medical School, about masks, and asked if it's a game changer the way the CDC is suggesting it is, the way that Dr. Redfield suggests it is. Here's what Harvard medical professor Kulldorff had to say, and the example he used to support his point on the issue.
I am doubtful about that. If they work, they may work a little bit, but I don't think it's a game changer. Sweden was the only country that did not close its schools. It didn't close daycare centers, nor primary school, nor middle schools. And for 1.8 billion children in Sweden of the pandemic, and of these 1.8 billion children, exactly 0 of them died in COVID-19. And none of these children were wearing any masks in the school, which is, of course, very difficult for children to do. So it's an example where the fact that they didn't wear masks in schools did not have any negative consequences in terms of the mortality in COVID-19 for these children.
So, as we know, this is not a laboratory experiment anymore. We have real-world examples, but those are dismissed as well because we still want to err on the side of an abundance of caution. We want to eliminate all risk, which is an impossible thing to do, and we just move the metrics that are important from hospitalizations or fatalities to just simply infections.
Right, and there's a lot of squirrely behavior as far as how some of those infections are measured, counted, defined. So those, and with a huge increase in the amount of testing, you've got all kinds of variables on that. It's interesting. The Washington Post had an editorial yesterday calling for throwing the kitchen sink at COVID, which would include shutting down all bars, restaurants, churches, and transit, prohibiting interstate travel. Basically a major national lockdown everywhere, even though there are a lot of places in this country that are not really getting hit very hard, like South Dakota. But I mean, are we supposed to punish South Dakota because because it doesn't have the fatalities that New York City had? It makes no sense.
Well, then there's Wyoming and Montana.
I mean, there's dozens upon dozens of states. It's not just even the sparsely populated states. I mean, this is all evidence free. This is all illogical, but it doesn't matter because, as was said, people are so whipped into pandemonium that there's no reasoning with some of them, including many of them in public office, where it's probably not pandemonium as much as it's a little bit more cynical.
Well, it's power for them. It's power, and they're getting a whole lot more money to dish out to their friends, to the teachers, to this group, to that group. I mean, they've had profound disruption of the economy, far greater than was necessary. And just to see these statewide shutdowns in places like Michigan and Oregon, I mean, most of the territory in those states had very little problem. But thanks to Portland and Detroit, let's punish everybody in the damn state. It's almost like it's almost as if the politicians and some of the health officials and editorial writers think that the more pain that they inflict, the healthier America will be.
And then you think about, I mean, the government has grown during the lockdown. Now we have contact tracers, and we've hired thousands of people for that. We have social distance ambassadors that they've hired hundreds of people for that. So do you think under a Biden administration that this is going to, the lockdown's going to remain? Or do you think, how do you see a Biden if he wins for president?
I don't know. I mean, Biden is a loose cannon on so many issues, and it's hard to know if he thinks at all, much less knowing what he thinks. But his folks tend to be more outspoken pro-government and pro-government force. And so I would think part of my concern is what this pandemic has shown is how easy it is for politicians to stir panic and shut down the churches, shut down the schools, shut down businesses on a whim, and completely disrupt the economy. And the politicians are paying no price for this. Zero price. They're being venerated by the media. It's like, their batting average isn't so good. I mean, Governor Cuomo's 6,000 dead people in the nursing homes after he ordered COVID patients to be sent there. But, I mean, that's not even an asterisk in the media coverage.
It is highly concerning. You wrote a piece about this topic at theamericanconservative.com, which takes us back to Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan. And that's where we're headed, right? We see it on the streets of our cities, and the appeasement in response to it, we're headed to state of nature politics. Might makes right.
Well, and it's spiraling out of control, and I'm all in favor of rowdy protests. I mean, that's who I am. I mean, but I mean, there's looting and burning, and let's burn up the Starbucks and burn up this and burn up that. I'm not a fan of Starbucks, different subject, but it's.
But you're also
just,
not a fan of arson, right? Yes.
Absolutely,
yes.
Absolutely. So it's here again. I'm amazed to see how the media has avoided covering most of the violence, or sugarcoats the violence where it says, well, it was a peaceful protest until the police or the federal agents made people angry. And it's like, yeah, I don't like having federal agents on the street out there in Portland or other places. But, I'm also not keen on burning down federal courthouses.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, though, a lot of just the politics of this, since it's been completely politicized, of course it has. This is all going to go away. COVID will disappear as an issue if Biden were to be elected because it's being used by the media to try and de-elect Trump. I think that's true to some extent in terms of how it's being used by the media and why. But I agree with you. Those who think it's going to go away, it's not going to go away because of exactly the incentives that you're describing, the incentives to expand power for politicians. Those are the benefits, and they're seeing approval ratings increase, at least in the short term. So there's even more incentive because then they're in a position of increased popularity and increased power, which increases their chances of maintaining their office. So why would you stop? This is a government-centric party, philosophy, movement, and this is the opportunity to fold everything into the government. And I just go back to Hobbes and this idea of conditioning people to autocratic governance, and the idea that things like happen in other countries can't happen in America. Well, they are right now.
Yep, and the thing that's surprising about Thomas Hobbes, at the time he wrote in the 1600s, people recognized that he was the ultimate friend of tyrants. But nowadays, a lot of people are saying, well, maybe some tyranny is good for us, so, let's see the bright side of Hobbes. I mean,
sure.
There was
yeah. Everybody always talks about the downside of tyranny, Jim. What about the benefits?
This is how a lot of liberals have portrayed Hobbes. There was a professor at University of Chicago who talked about Hobbes being a pre-liberal, which makes as much sense as talking about Hitler being a post-liberal. I mean, this is just unlimited power with no restraint, and it's like, well, it's good for us because it's what we need. I'm thinking like, tell that to the CDC.
Jim Bovard, author of 10 books, member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, frequent contributor to The Hill, a contributor to the American Conservative. I just mentioned this piece he did on Hobbes, How Intellectuals Cured Tyrannophobia, at theamericanconservative.com, which you should check out, and I'll tweet out. James Bovard, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks. It was fun.
Take care.
Yeah. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
This is Lon Hee Chen of the Hoover Institution for Townhall.com. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a major speech last week outlining a new approach to dealing with China. For many years, American policymakers have assumed that as China became more prosperous, it would become freer, more open, and a responsible member of the international community. We now know these assumptions were wrong. So what do we do about it? The Trump administration is proposing a more clear-eyed view of China. We must recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is espousing a morally bankrupt ideology. Communism and socialism have never worked and never will. We must, in Pompeo's words, engage and empower the Chinese people. And we must also join with the free nations of the world to push back on the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. Pompeo suggested a new alliance of democracies. That's exactly the kind of bold action we need to meet this great challenge of our time. I'm Lon Hee Chen.
The Pepperdine School of Public Policy, America's unique graduate program for leaders. Learn more at publicpolicy.pepperdine.edu.
Join me, Steve Cortez, and the great Dennis Prager for AM 560 Cigar Night 2020, happening August 20th at the Humidor Cigar Lounge in Lisle. It'll be an evening of great conversation and fine cigars, but tickets are sold out, including
Boo.
VIP.
And people, please stop emailing